If you take your credit card and you go shopping and you run up a large credit card debt, you're running a trade deficit with all those shops. Now, it would be pretty strange if you then blamed all the shop owners for having sold you all those things. You're ripping me off, you're ripping me off, you're ripping me off, I'm running a trade deficit. That is the level of understanding of the President of the United States. The trade deficit does not represent at all trade policies. It represents spending relative to production or earnings. We call that an identity. I teach it in the second day of my course in international monetary economics. Trump never made it to the second day. So he says, you're running a trade deficit. Look, they're all cheating me. But all that's happening is the United States is outspending its national income. And you can look at the national income chart. You can add up consumption and investment and government spending, and you could subtract off gross national product, and lo and behold, what will that equal? Not approximately, exactly. That will equal the current account deficit, which is the comprehensive measure of how much you spend on goods and services versus how much you sell in goods and services. So the United States runs a current account deficit because it spends more than it produces. Why does it do that? We have a big credit card in the United States. It's called the national government. The U.S. government spends about $2 trillion a year more than it takes in revenues. What it's doing is making transfers to the American people and to American businesses. It doesn't tax Americans for those transfers because, here's another little fact, because the congressmen that vote on the budget got into office by being paid for their campaigns by rich people who don't like taxes. So the political system says spend, but don't tax us. So we run a chronic deficit in the United States. That spending goes out either as transfer payments or goods and services, and that's more than our national income, which is about $30 trillion, and our spending is about $31 trillion. And that's our trade deficit. And for that, Donald Trump blames the world. Okay, I fail him for this if he were my student. He's my president. It's a little weirder because when he did this, in 2 days, the world lost $10 trillion of market capitalization. By the way, where did it go? Did it get transferred from here to here? No, it got destroyed. Why destroyed? Because trade, something also the President of the United States doesn't understand, is mutually beneficial. So if you stop trade, everybody loses. It's not that one side wins, the other side loses. He cannot understand that concept as a guy that traded real estate in New York. So his idea is somebody had to win, somebody had to lose. But what happened when he made this announcement was $10 trillion was wiped out worldwide. It's not that the U.S. went up and they went down. No, everybody went down. Because the whole world system is based on a division of labor, and he's breaking that division of labor into pieces. So then people said, this doesn't make sense. Even the very rich people that gave him the money for him to get into office started saying this doesn't make sense. The hedge fund managers who were his big campaign contributors. Elon Musk, who paid for his election and became prime minister, he said this doesn't make sense. And then the markets said this doesn't make sense. Not only $10 trillion, but as the finance minister said, interest rates started to rise because people began to dump U.S. Treasury debt.
The safest thing in the world, apparently.
So, interesting what happened. It's not quite true that he reversed things. First, he left on this 10% tariff, except for one country, for China,
145%
where he
on some
raised
products.
the tariff rates. That's because the United States has a deep, neurotic attachment to China. The U.S. political system hates China. Why? Because China's big and successful. And so that the U.S. hates. It's a rival, it's a competitor, and so this is the one thing he left on. Now, he's going to mess up everything with this too, because in a trade war between the U.S. and China, China wins. China does not depend on the U.S. market very much. It's about 12% of China's exports. China will do just fine. It's just dumb policy. There's no more, sorry to say it, there's just no more explanation to this than that. It makes no sense. Now, it raises, if I could, just one last point. How can this happen when it makes no sense? And that, people should understand, we are in one-person rule in the United States. Our political system is in a state of collapse. What President Trump did is an emergency decree. Everything he does is an emergency decree. Literally, you can go on to whitehouse.gov and then follow the menu to executive decrees. And there are dozens of them. And each one starts the same way. With the powers invested in me as President of the United States, I hereby declare A, nonsense, B, nonsense, C, nonsense. Because he's king. Those powers are not invested in the President of the United States. They're invested in the Congress. You read Article 1, Section 8 of our Constitution. It says that all duties originate with the Congress. And specifically in the lower house, all legislation has to start in the House of Representatives. But the U.S., starting in 1945 after World War II, became a military state to a large extent. And so it sprinkled in its legislation emergency, emergency, emergency. And Trump doesn't have to prove anything's an emergency, he just has to say something's an emergency. So suddenly the trade deficit became an emergency, and on that basis he issues a one-person rule. Even his aides don't know what he's doing. You raise one final interesting issue, which is that the market recovered about $4 trillion when he reversed. Anyone who knew that 5 minutes before made billions. This is not the cleanest government in the world, I can tell you. I'd be hugely surprised if some people didn't know just a bit ahead of time, starting with members of the U.S. Congress, by the way. I think the particular tariff rates that Trump announced last week that led to that financial bloodbath are not going to come back. So I don't think we're going to hear again about those numbers after 90 days. 90 days in U.S. time now is infinity. It's eternity. We'll never hear those numbers again. Where did those numbers come from? Something, again, so stupid you can't believe that any country would do this. But the idea is the following. As I said, if you want to know what your trade balance is, you earn some income, so you sell some services to somebody, and you buy things. And if you spend what you earn, you're in trade balance. Technically, you're in current account balance. Now, most of us, I work for one employer, my university, so I run a big trade surplus with my university. And then I run a pretty big trade deficit with the grocery store that we buy our groceries from, and if I have to buy shoes, I run a trade deficit with the shoe store, and so forth. Trump's idea, just to add to the craziness of it, is that you should run a trade balance with everybody, not an overall trade balance, but a trade balance with everybody. So you should sell a little bit, you should work a little bit for your shoe store, you should work a little bit for your grocery store, you should go around anytime you want to shop, you trade something. I'll write you an essay if you'll sell me shoes, and you make your living somehow trying to balance your trade with all of your counterparts. Well, this is insane. This is why we have a market economy. You don't have to have balance with every transaction that you do with somebody. But what Trump said was, oh, Lesotho, they sell us more than we buy from them. So they're cheating us. That's literally what he said. Literally what he said. Okay, is it completely delusional or rhetoric? It's delusional, okay? Just so you know. It's weird. But anyway, now, then he calculated a formula. Okay, Lesotho, we have to tax them by the amount to reduce the imports from them so that we have balance with Lesotho. And then they made some absolutely stupid formula that you would not accept in a first year, third week class. It came out of the U.S. Trade Representative's office. They probably were told, do it overnight, the boss wants it. And then they came up with a list of tariffs, country by country, based on the bilateral trade balance. You cannot make this stuff up. This is not it used to be not a Mickey Mouse country, my country. But this is Mickey Mouse. This is not, and I apologize to Mickey Mouse. He would not do this. Mickey Mouse is smarter than this. So we are in a crazy land, actually, with this. Now, it stopped for a moment. We'll never hear those numbers again. I don't know what we'll hear in 3 months. God help us, really. Because it probably won't have to do with trade. It'll have to do with something else. But we can't normalize this as what's the rationale, how to negotiate, what to do. Of course, 60 countries immediately said, we'll rebalance with you. And the President of the United States literally used the language I'm about to use. I'm quoting him because otherwise I would never say this. He said, 60 countries are coming to kiss my ass. He said that in a public speech, the President of the United States. So this is, I'm sorry, I apologize.
No,
but it's presidential language.
Yeah.
Okay? I'm only speaking at high political terms. So we cannot normalize this. We have to say no. We didn't spend 100 years on 200 years, 207 years since David Ricardo put forward the idea of comparative advantage, okay? And we have been building the trade system since the ruins of World War II for 80 years. And we have been building the World Trade Organization, which the U.S. led the creation of, I think it's fair to say, for 31 years. This should not be normalized to try to figure out what is the theory of this. And it's a more fundamental point, ladies and gentlemen. The United States is a rogue nation right now on many things, not just on trade, but on making Gaza into the U.S. Riviera, on whatever it wants to say. It's a little bit of a rogue nation. For the world to hold together, the rest of the world has to say, we're not going down crazy lane. We're going to be responsible. We're going to go to the UN. We're going to go to the World Trade Organization. We're not going to get into this downward spiral. Because if we normalize craziness, there is no way out. The Secretary of Treasury, then, with all deference to a person who has a very hard job, he says, this was planned all along when Trump dropped this. Can you imagine?
He couldn't say anything else, though.
Well, yeah, I know, but to hear this from your Treasury Secretary is not also reassuring, because all you hear is a crazy land rather than what we need to hear, which is rationality.
Okay.
Here's where the U.S. really failed over the last 40 years. We let the inequalities widen and widen, partly because of automation, partly because jobs did go overseas, but for the right reason. They had comparative advantage in those jobs. Skilled people got better and better salaries. Lower skilled people had their living standards fall. The gap widened. By the way, not just the income gap, the life expectancy became 10 years or more. So many of our epidemics, so many of our social problems relate to this widening inequality. The United States political system didn't address it at all for 40 years. And that comes to what I mentioned, the corruption of the political system. When candidates of both political parties are paid by rich donors for their reelection campaigns, and both parties then become the agents of tax cuts and no really addressing the social conditions, you end up with a Donald Trump coming in and selling a pseudo explanation, it's all China, and selling a pseudo remedy, a trade war. What the auto workers are going to learn right now is they're going to lose jobs by even the tariffs that have been put in place, because we need the intermediate parts brought in from elsewhere. Now they face higher costs, and the United States can't compete at all with Chinese electric vehicles. The United States has basically handed China the electric vehicle market for the next 20 years. So did Europe, by the way. Europe delayed the transformation to electric vehicles, said we produce great internal combustion engines, we're going to continue to do that. The world actually needs electric vehicles because of the climate crisis. So all of this is to say the real hard work is to think ahead. Mm-hmm. The country, by the way, in my experience of working all over the world in the last 40 years, that thinks ahead the most is China. Mm-hmm. China's success is not random. China's success actually is a lot of forward-looking planning. In 2014, China issued a document called Made in China 2025. And it wasn't a protectionist policy, it was, we need to invest in the technology so we can be at the forefront. I think in 8 of the 10 sectors that were identified there, China succeeded in reaching the forefront. In 2017, China made a plan for artificial intelligence. This is already 8 years ago. DeepSeek didn't just come out of nowhere, it came out of a long-term strategy. So this is hard work that actually pays off. This is what every government should do. This is what every country should do, is look ahead. Now, you mentioned very interesting idea. We got a president who doesn't understand and maybe doesn't care about the future in the same way. But just to say, the biggest issue on the planet should be the climate crisis, not all the things we're endlessly talking about. And every part of the world is going to suffer terribly by what has been built in terrible, very dangerous climate change. It's out of the headlines. But, you know, I had a very difficult job. I was the director of an institute with 300 climate scientists for 14 years, some of the world's leading climate scientists. The reason it was a hard job is that every week they came up and told me, it's worse than we thought. They would give me endlessly grim news. And the lead climate scientist at Columbia University is a man named James Hansen, who I regard as the world's leading climate scientist. And he produced a study in January that said it's much worse than we have thought. The world's temperature has gone up by 0.3 degrees Celsius in 3 years. We have had 21 months of the last 22 above 1.5 degrees. That's the new baseline, by the way. That's not because of an El Nino effect. That's the new baseline. We already blew the limit that we set 10 years ago in Paris that we said we would not exceed. We're already above it. And what Hansen says is we're rising at an accelerating rate. Now the average rate is probably between 0.3 and 0.4 degrees Celsius per decade now on average. So we'll be at 2 degrees excess. What all of this means is profound danger 20 years from now, 25, 30, but we're already seeing terrible danger today. I don't want to minimize what's already happening. Los Angeles burned down, massive forest fires in Korea last week. It's everywhere. My wife and I are nonstop traveling. Every single place we go is some kind of climate crisis, literally. It's a drought, it's floods, it's heat waves, it's pest infestations, it's forest fires. And the sea level is going to rise by many meters, which is not great for Istanbul, by the way, and not great for coastal areas. It's very dangerous what is built into the system. Now, what is Trump's answer for this? Yesterday, King Donald issued an executive decree to bring back coal. It's willful destruction of well-being, willful. And that is, again, he pulled out of the Paris Agreement. What I'm hoping, ladies and gentlemen, is the other 192 members of the UN have to say, no, we're not entering a crazy land. We're going to take care of our future. Right now, I live in a crazy land. But the rest of the world has to avoid the crazy land, has to avoid normalizing this.
Yeah, it does work.
Okay, thank you very much. I have a question for Mr. Jeffrey Sachs. My name is Sarsin Anajer, and I'm from Harici News. So you mentioned that we shouldn't look for a rationale behind the actions of Donald Trump, but just to be a devil's advocate, I just want to understand their point of view, which they mention, yes, trade deficit and the national debt of the United States, but also they mention the hard industries that left United States back in the day. So what I'm trying to understand is, if United States gets into a confrontation with global powers such as China or Russia or any other state, maybe even Europe one day, is it wrong for them to want their hard industries back, and this is their rationale to put these tariffs on? Because Donald Trump mentioned that we are buying cars from Canada that we could have been producing before. So is there a rationale behind, at least on the hard industry part?
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, you know, in trade theory or trade concept, there is the national security rationale. So you may want to procure domestically to have an armaments industry. That's quite different from imposing tariffs on 150 countries in a completely arbitrary way. In fact, the right policy might be local procurement from domestic industry that has nothing to do with trade policy at all. So that is not an argument for what he's doing. But I would add one more point. We don't need an arms race, and we don't need a war. Actually, diplomacy is really cheap compared to war. That's why we're at the Antalya Diplomacy Forum, not the Antalya Military Forum. So if Trump really wanted to save some money, we have almost 800 overseas military bases in 80 countries. This is crazy. So if he wanted to save money and close the budget deficit, I would close hundreds and hundreds of military bases and leave all these countries at peace, because wherever there's an American military base, there's a big headache, believe me.